Heat maps are a fantastic way to show concentration and density of data within your reports. Well, today I'll showcase 3 different types of heat maps and then ultimately how to create this completely dynamic heat map that allows you to select your different sort of types and then turn off the colors completely dynamically and independently to each other. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So I'll start with what the different types of heat maps are, because we're going to build these individually to eventually get to our combined ultimate heat map, but we need to understand what they are. So the first type of heat map is an overall density. So we have our maximum value and then we have our minimum value. This type of heat map is essentially just showing you where that density lies, or the colors are graded based on the maximum value. So these are the maximum, this is the maximum value. Anything near that will be red, and then the smaller values, they will be gray. So it's based on the overall numbers and the overall data set. The second type of heat map we have is at a row level. So for example, we can see in September, 59 is our largest value. So it's grading that the maximum color that we've defined as blue. But for Argentina, we can see 50 is the lowest value and 245 is the maximum. So this type of heat map is showing you the density at a row level. So it's really good for identifying what the trends are at a row level or whatever split that you're doing. And then Heatmap Type 3, this is really simple. This is just a minimum and maximum at a row level. So we can see the minimum and then the maximum. In the ultimate heat map, I show you how to sort of switch on and turn that off, so you can choose between the different types, and it's completely dynamic with how that works. So let's go ahead and start. But essentially, we're going to learn how to build these heat maps individually, and then we'll get to this ultimate heat map, just so we build up that understanding. So we're going to start off with, how do you create a heat map that has this design? So it looks, fundamentally, it just looks good, because a lot of heat maps that I see, this don't look that great. So let's do overall grading and then the colors. So the way that we do this is we select a matrix table, and then we can bring anything into our rows and our columns. So for my rows, I'm going to do subcategory. Oh, I don't know what happened there. Subcategory. And then for my columns, I'm going to do month. And then for my values, I'm going to bring in a quantity sum. So this is a very simple measure, which is just a sum of my quantity column. So if I make this bigger, we can see we have a table, but there's no heat and it looks poor. So the first thing that I recommend doing is going to the formatting tab and then go to layout, styles and presets, and then set that to none. Immediately, that means we have no background, nothing. It's just a blank canvas. From there, we go to grid. We can go to options, and then your row padding, you want to adjust that. So you want to make it breathe a little bit so it has some room, and then your font size, adjust that how you will. So this is completely up to you. There's no right or wrong. Now for the sake of demonstrating this, I'm going to turn on the colors now. So if we go to cell elements, and because this is the overall density, so just your generic heat map, if we go to cell elements, select your values. If you have multiple, you can do so, but then turn on your background color, and then we have that. But that looks quite poor. So what we can do is, if we go to our grid again, turn on horizontal grid lines and then vertical grid lines. And then what you can do is adjust the thickness of this vertical grid line. So 4 is quite a good number. And then you have these really nice boxes. But the issue is your background and your grid lines, they need to match essentially, because I have a white background and my grid lines are grey. So what that means is you can clearly see them. So if I select white, and then select white again, this now blends in very nicely. So let me turn off our column subtotals and our row subtotals. And then the colors, we can adjust that as well. Now it's worth noting, because we're doing a dynamic heat map in our ultimate, we need to use our gradient. So we need to use the standard gradient that we have for our colors, so the minimum and maximum values. We want that to apply for the various different types of heat maps. So we're going to be using gradient for this, where we can define the lowest value as red and the maximum value as green. Let's keep it really simple. And if we want, we can add a middle color, and let's set that to gray. So now we have quite a nice heat map that shows us our maximum value, our lowest, and our sort of average or middle sort of numbers that we have. So that's Heatmap Type 1, really simple to set up, and it looks really clean. So feel free to give that a go. But now we're going to move on to Heatmap Type 2. Just to recap what this heat map is doing, it is working out the maximum values or doing the grading at a row level. So 245, that's our largest quantity in September. We can see that's a dark blue, and 59, that's the largest, so that's a dark blue as well. But 80 over here, that's a grey, because for this particular country and in this split that we have here over months, that's a low value. But how does that work when we've been doing this at a minimum and maximum? Well, if we take a look at Heatmap Type 1, if we go to our formatting and our background color, we can see that it's got the minimum and maximum and is basing that on our quantity sum. So that's our values here. But let's take a look at this again. We can then adjust what the conditional formatting is being based on. So we don't have to use the values here. We can specify our own calculation, which will be like a virtual table in the background, and it will run the conditional formatting based on that calculation. So knowing that, what can we do to make the maximum values at a row level the same so that the maximum in our conditional formatting is the same, or the minimum? So what we can do is a rank X. So let me bring that in so you can see it. And our maximum value is 1, so in our rank, and then at a row level, the maximum once again is a 1. So we have the same value for the maximum at a row level now. And the calculation that we're using is rank X, and in the all selected, this needs to be your columns or whatever you have in your split here. So I have months, so I've defined that there. The reason that I have if not is blank is we don't want to account for blanks in our calculation. We don't want it to rank from 0 or a blank. So we're ignoring that, and then we're doing a rank X. So what we can do, and what's very important, is we go to our background color and then we adjust that to this calculation. So if I do quantity row level, and then it will do the minimum maximum based on the row level calculation that we defined, and it's not doing it on the values that we had in the table. Now it's worth noting that I've actually switched this where I've done the lowest value. So 1 obviously is the largest quantity, but that's actually the minimum value in our sort of gradient. We can adjust that, so you don't have to do it that way. I don't know why I did it like that, but we can do ascend instead, so that instead of it being 1, it can be 8, and then we can change it so that our maximum value is a dark blue, and then our least quantity is 1. So I've literally just flipped it, but by default, I don't know why, but I did it as that. It's just playing around with the sort order and then making that sort order match your gradient. So that's Heatmap Type 2. So what we've learned is we can change our background color or our conditional formatting based on a separate calculation, and the calculation to do the row level is this one here. So you have the pbix file available, you have to do a rank X, and then the columns that you have here. Actually, let me show this. So instead of month name, I might use, so let me just save this here quickly. Instead of month name, let's use subcategory. And then in my table, if I bring in subcategory, it's doing the same thing now at a subcategory level. So whatever your split is here, you need to have in your all selected, or even all, you need to have that there. And if I change that back to months, it's no longer going to work. So let me bring back in month name. Cool, so that's Heatmap Type 2. Let's move on to Heatmap Type 3. So moving on to the third Heatmap type, where we look at the minimum and maximum values. So we can see we have the minimum and then the maximum. Let me just turn on the values so we can see what it looks like. We can see that's the maximum value and that's the minimum. Now we've already established that we don't have to use these values to do our conditional formatting, otherwise it wouldn't work. So let's bring in the calculation and see what it's doing at a row level. So we can see it's returning a 1 for the minimum and a 2 for the maximum. So it needs to calculate what those values are, then return 1 and 2 for the minimum and maximum values. So let's take a look at the calculation. It's building a virtual table. So we have the month column or whatever is in our columns in our matrix, and then it's returning the quantity, or essentially it's doing a grouping where it's returning the quantity by that split that we have here. Then we're doing a calculation that returns the minimum and maximum values for this virtual table. So this is a virtual table and it's returning the minimum and maximum. Now at this point, think that if this was dropped into the table, it would split the months out within our columns, and then it would work out the minimum at a row level. So the minimum value and then the maximum value, it will return that at a row level because of it splitting out this table that we built here. Now, because we've done that, if we say, so this is our current value, so these are the values that we have in here, so this is the measure. If we say, if the value here equals the minimum value that we split in our virtual table, return 1. And if the current value equals the maximum value in our virtual table, so the current value is, let's say, 132, and then the maximum value in our virtual table when it's split out is 132, return 2. So that's essentially the calculation where we've built a virtual table, and then that's going to split out, and then we get that minimum and maximum, and then compare that to our current value that we have in our table. So that's how we return 1 and 2, and then we can then just apply our conditional formatting to our table as well. We don't need to have a middle color because it's returning only 2 values. And then for our empty, because we're going to only have 2 values in our table, we want to set that to gray, essentially. So that's how we create Heatmap Type 2. The calculation is available, but we're getting the minimum maximum at a row level and returning 1 and 2. So moving on to our final visual, which is a combination of all of the heat maps where we can select the different types in a completely dynamic way, turn on the values if we want to, or turn them off to make it easier to see the heat. It's completely up to you. Now, it's worth noting that this visual is comprised of 2 elements essentially. We have our slicer that allows us to select our different calculation, then our heat map that has our dynamic calculations in the background. Now, these images are bespoke, but we don't have to use that. We can just use a standard slicer and it's the exact same calculations. So if you don't want to create images, you don't have to. You can just use a standard slicer as well. So I'll start off with the logic because it's the same thing. And then if you want to create the images and have something a little bit more bespoke, you can stay to the end of the video where I showcase how to create this. So what we have to do is create a completely dynamic calculation where our selections change the conditional formatting. So to have dynamic calculations where we can select different calculations, we have to use field parameters. So if we go to modeling, select new parameter and then fields, we can then choose the calculations that we created. So our overall, our row level, and then our minimum and maximum. Then if I just call this heatmap selection, and then click create, it will generate this heat map or this field parameter table with this column called parameter. And then if we bring that into a slicer, it will have our different calculations. So we can see we have our different calculations. Now at this point, this calculation is not linked to any of the previous ones that we created. So what we have to do is create some dynamic measures. So the way that we do that, if we take a look at this calculation, we're building a virtual table that has all of our field parameter options. So these are our different calculations. And we're saying if the selected value equals 1, return the value that we selected in our field parameter. The reason we're doing equals 1 and we're doing an if count rows, we're saying if the selected value in this virtual table of just the list of calculations is filtered and then results in 1. So when it's doing the count rows, it's going to count rows of this virtual table, and that virtual table has been filtered to just 1 because we can only select 1. So if it equals 1, return whatever's been selected. And then at that point, we can just do if the selected value equals min and max, return the min and max calculation. If the selected value equals row weighting, return that, etc, etc. So this count rows and virtual table is essentially just returning the calculation or returning the value that we selected in our parameter. And the next part is then saying whatever's been selected in our parameter, return that calculation as well. So that's the first part of our heat map background. And then what we can do is just apply that to our standard table. So if we go to our cell elements, select background color, and then use our heat map background that we just created to that calculation there, it will then return a completely dynamic background for our. So we've created our heat map selector that allows us to choose what heat map. Okay. So we've created a heat map selector that allows us to choose what type of heat map that is. Let's do something similar where we create a toggle for turning the values on or turning them off. So similar to what we had before, we need to create a selector, but we don't actually have any calculations for our 2 options, which is colors or values. So to do that, let's just first take a look at what options I have, values and color. what we can do is create a table by selecting enter data and then just creating 2 rows. So we can do color and then we can do values, and you can call this whatever you want to. So let's just call this toggle on. So I already actually have a table, so I'm not going to load this in, but if we bring that value into a slicer, we have 2 options to either turn on the colors or the values. But now we have to actually link this to our measures and make this dynamic with our font color. So if we go to our cell elements, we have 2 options. We have background color and then font color. So it's worth noting that we're going to be utilizing this empty values field here. So we have our numbers and the minimum and maximum for the grading. And if there's no numbers, we're going to return a grade. So let's take a look at the calculation that's performing the font. So we're saying the selected value in our new column that we created. If the selected value equals color, then return whatever calculation and the numbers that we have here. So let me select color, and we can see we now have numbers. So that the new formatting, the calculation for our fonts is returning a number when we have a selection of color. So by doing that, our background color is going to have a grading and when there's values. And when we have values for our font color, it's going to follow the same grading. So by doing that, we're going to have a blend, but we can't actually see any values. But if nothing is selected, so once again, looking at our calculation, if color is not selected, then just return a blank. So we have nothing selected, or if we select values, because it's not color, it's returning a blank. And then what we've done in the formatting and the font color, if the numbers for this calculation, so the conditional formatting of the font is blank, then return a gray. Now, it's a little bit confusing, but maybe watch that a couple times. But essentially we're saying if there's colors and there's value, if we select color, show values, and these values are color graded the same as the background color, so they just blend in. If no color is selected and it's the values, for example, and so that's blank, then it's going to return a gray. Or if we change that to black, for example, we can say if there's no numbers, because we have nothing selected, return blank. So that's how we do our conditional formatting for our color selector. So this is completely dynamic with both working together in conjunction. So let's move on to our tile slicer, which is a lot more bespoke when it comes to the report. It's a lot more bespoke and it's actually quite simple to do as well. So let's move on to that. So let's move on to how we create this very bespoke slicer selector. We know how to do the logic. How do we create this slicer that has all these icons? Now, these icons are bespoke and I have provided them in the description. So if you want to use the ones I've provided, you can, but we do have to create these using Figma, but it's very simple to do. So let's go ahead and actually create a one ourselves. So to do that, we need to use the tile slicer. So this is a new slicer that's available. If we use this and then bring in our calculation selector, so this was the field parameters that we had before, we now have our various options. Let's change the layout of this from grid to a single column and then adjust the size to how we want that to look in our table. So this is the size that we have to stick to essentially. I'm just going to position that slightly more center and then turn off the title. We now have the sizing that we're happy with. So once we've done that, let's grab the height and the width and then head over to Figma. So in Figma, if we just create a rectangle and then use the height and width that we've had here, so 557 and then 161. So the height is 557 and then 161. So we have our dimensions. What we can do now is we know we have 3 slicer selections. So let's create 3 cards just so we get the right size. So let's change the color of this to white. So if we go to fill and change that to white, and then let's just copy that 3 times. So that's slightly small, so I'm going to make them slightly bigger. And there's probably a better way to do this, but I'm more accustomed to Photoshop than Figma, so I'm doing this a little bit manually. So that was a bit small. I'm going to grab another one, and I think that is fine. So I'm happy with this. So we can use this sizing. So we've got our 3 shapes. We know what the sizing is. We can then just delete these 2 and just focus just on the one. So if I zoom into this, this is going to be what's in our actual images. What we can do is create the rectangles. Very simple. Just create 3 rectangles, choose a gray, and then let's change the corner radius to 3. Actually, 3 is a bit much. Let's do 2. Not even 2. We have to go to 1. Let's go to 1. Okay, so we've got that. Let's copy this and then do that again. I'm going to select all 3 by holding Shift, center that. So I've got all 3. I'm going to center that and then create a group selection, and then copy that group, bring it down. Let's copy that group again and bring it down. So we have our 3 options. And then for my background, I don't want that to be a white. I want that to be a grey. So let me just go down slightly. There we go. And then if I grab my groups, let's just position it to the center. And then I want an icon effect. So I'm going to use a background. I'm going to create a white background. So it's very much app-like. Let's make that white and bring that rectangle behind our groups. And then what we can do is round the edges of this to, let's say, 5. And then because this is my min and max, I'm going to select one of the icons and make that red. And let's make this one green because this is our minimum and maximum icon. And then we can do the same multiple times across all 3. So let's just use red and then the green again. And the final time, let's do that one as red. And then that one as green. So we have our icon now. What we have to do is export this. So to do that, what we can do is merge these elements together. So let's flatten them. So right click and then flatten. And then if we export, we can then export the vector. So this is the actual image that we want. So if we go back to our Power BI, to get the image into our report, we need to have a sheet or a table that has our selection. So we want to call that image. So make that match your calculation name and then the image link. So if I go to Excel, it's a very simple file that has our selection and the image link. And this image link has to be an accessible link to Power BI. So that could be SharePoint, or I've used Dropbox. And that link, we have to do something very specific. So if I copy a link, let's grab the icon that we just created. So I'm going to upload it, download. So that was the new icon. Let that upload. And then if we grab the link, let's copy that. What we have to do is make sure at the end we remove the DL equals 0 and then change that to raw equals 1. So we've got our link. I'm just going to replace the icon that I already. Go back to my Power BI. Let me refresh that table. So you will have to import a spreadsheet that has the name and then the different links. And if we go to our tile slicer, go to image, and then we can add that field here. So image URL. And then if I refresh that, that should use my new icon. We have to ensure that the image URL has this icon mode selected. So image URL is the data category, and then that will then fit into our, it will actually show as an image. Now to make it fit, if we go to image, you will have to make sure that it is set to fill or fit. So it depends on your visual. Now for our default state, we want that to be a dark gray, and let's turn the saturation down. So it's very obvious that it's not been selected. And then when something is over hover, saturation up, and then transparency 0. So it's very obvious. Then once again, we can go to our selected and then just make sure the saturation is 100% and transparency is 0. So when we do our selection, that is very obviously selected. Now for our labels, we need to go to our buttons, and then for our default state, we want that to be white. And then for our selected state, I want that to be white as well. So let's set that to white. And then the border, let's set that to white as well. So we have our different states. And then for our values, so if we go to call out values, we want our default to be black and then our selected to be black as well. And then we can adjust the alignment. So our default is in the center, and then when we select, it's in the center as well. Now if we want a description or a subcategory, what we can do is turn on our labels and then bring that in there as well. It's completely up to you. Now I'm not going to show I'm not going to show how to create the other three because we've just done the one and it's pretty much the same step again, but you just have to create two more different icons. So it's very easy to do, but hopefully this video is useful. That is a very dynamic heat map. This was quite a long video, took me quite a few takes as well. I messed up a couple times, but if that was useful, please do like and subscribe. It really does help the channel. But with that, we have our ultimate heat map select.